thanks again for meeting. I also was just especially grateful looking at your work because I think it's so easy to become disillusioned with how slow social change can be. So just seeing that you've been able to do it for so many years has been like so inspiring and wonderful to see, and that you're like still working with it. So that's been really cool. And I knew a little bit about your background. Do you want to just give any more details that might not be in the exit interview or on the website yet?
Um, well, I gave you the thumbnail. I got started when I was 16, and that was all a result of the Vietnam War. And, being, I was always interested in the news, and especially world news and stuff. And I just, for whatever reason, never kind of believed the official line about Vietnam. And it was one day, quite unexpectedly, on my way home from high school, what had been a pet shop was suddenly a Gene McCarthy for President campaign office. This is 1 week after he came in a very close second to Lyndon Johnson in the New Hampshire primary, and Johnson dropped out of the race, the incumbent president. And it turned out that the guy who owned the pet shop, who was inspired to turn it into a campaign office, the guy who converted his pet shop, which was a project for his retirement, turned out he had been a very well-known labor leader nationally. I lived in New Jersey, just outside of Camden, where the big Campbell's soup factory was. And he was responsible for organizing that, bringing the union into that factory. He was also a veteran of the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. Are you familiar with them?
No.
During the Spanish Civil War, just before World War II, there was a fascist takeover in Spain, and there was a revolution of Spaniards and people from around the world who came to fight the fascists in Spain, including a large contingent of Americans who became known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. So this guy just had tons of stories from his long history of organizing. And although the office was mostly staffed by young people like my age and 16, 17, 18, he would come by in the evenings and just talk to us about organizing. So I learned a lot, and the first thing I learned from that is how important it is to tell these stories about organizing. So that's one of the reasons I'm really happy to do the interview with you. I like having these opportunities. So, I was always involved in something as a volunteer, as most of us are in terms of activism, on evenings and weekends and stuff, petitions and leafleting, all that kind of stuff. And in the mid 80s, I decided to make a change and quit a pretty good paying job and took a part-time bookkeeper job at the Peace and Justice Center. And the rest, as they say, is history, sort of. I just stuck on there. And as I mentioned, I've also myself worked for the Healthcare Workers Union. That was SEI, Service Employees International Union, Local 250. They since left SEIU and became an independent union called United Healthcare Workers West or something. I worked for Quest for Peace for a while as the West Coast coordinator. That was a project where during the 80s, after the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua, Congress was financing the Contras to fight against the revolutionary government. And the Quest for Peace project was to raise humanitarian aid for Nicaragua from the American people directly that would match the congressional aid going to the Contras trying to fight it. And that was a really interesting job. It had me traveling to Nicaragua a couple of times and really making the opportunity to make presentations to audiences that you wouldn't normally be able to. When you're asking for something like donations of clothing to help people, you get invited to churches and stuff to come make your pitch, where if you wanted to go talk about the Sandinistas, they wouldn't want to talk to you, but they'd be glad to participate in a clothing drive,
Huh.
in which case you can talk about the reality of U.S. policy in Nicaragua in the context of doing your presentation. And you can see people rethinking and changing their minds in a situation like that when they are finally exposed to alternative points of view. So that was an interesting experience. But most of my time outside of volunteering for all kinds of causes for a long time was most of the work through the Peace and Justice Center.
Mhm.
Although the one story I've thought I might highlight for you does have to do with the healthcare workers union. So when you're ready for examples, I think I've got a good one for you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, that was just my next question. How have you used community organizing, and can you give examples?
So the example I thought I'd start with, the first one was when I was working for the healthcare workers union. I was hired as I had been working at the Peace and Justice Center for a number of years, had a dispute with the board, and I left. But SEIU hired me based on my experience in being a community organizer, and my title with the union was community organizer. It meant I wasn't working with the workers. I wasn't trying to organize and bring the union into a workplace. I was working with the community on issues of importance to the union. And it was a number of different things, but one of the really interesting situations, and it's a good example because we actually won something this time,
Oh,
is
amazing.
there was a public community hospital in Richmond. I believe it was called Mount Diablo Medical Center. And these are all, they have small districts that collect a little taxes to help pay for the community hospital. Let's make sure there's at least some level of care in hospitals. So these are public organizations. They have elected boards, publicly elected boards and things like that. This one was in huge financial trouble. And it was clear, and the employees there were in our union. So we were trying to save jobs and make sure the union was there and to save the hospital. Well, it was clear that a hospital, uh, some other hospital chain was going to have to take them over.
Mm.
It was the end of the line. There were no other state or tax solutions that were going to get them out of this problem. So my first assignment was to try to make sure that whoever was going to take over this hospital was at least a nonprofit hospital chain and not one of the big for-profit chains. Well, it very quickly changed my assignment because only one hospital chain made a bid and made an overture to buy Mount Diablo, and that was Tenet Corporation, which is not only a large profit-making hospital chain, it is the largest for-profit hospital chain in the country.
Mm-hmm.
So our demands were going to be keep the union workers, keep community health care, keep costs down. And it was going to be a tough job. So I didn't know anything about Richmond or Contra Costa County. I had never done any organizing there. So one of the things I've learned over the years is when you're going into a new situation and trying to organize a community, it's really helpful to go to where people are already organized in some form. They're used to coming together. So a lot of churches have social concerns committees and things like that. I sat down with the phone book and found a bunch of neighborhood associations in Richmond and the area. And then you try to find organizations that will sign on, and that was fairly easy. And I'd been telling my direct supervisor that I had a meeting coming up with the NAACP to try to interest them in this. And he said, oh man, I wouldn't waste my time with the NAACP in Richmond. They're more like the Chamber of Commerce for Richmond. They're really interested in businesses. they're going to be all in favor of tenant. And I said, I bet they won't be. I bet they'll see a place where their role in the community is worth more than supporting some anonymous profit-making corporation that's headquartered elsewhere. And that actually turned out to be the case. But in a lot of ways, because of NAACP's reputation in Richmond, I did have the Chamber of Commerce on my side. Because they were kind of fulfilling that role, but they really threw themselves into it. So as a result of going out and talking to a lot of neighborhood associations, a lot of them didn't want to bother, but a number of them had me come. We finally put together a core group of people, which also included a number of Republicans. One guy in particular, who was a fairly well-known businessman in Richmond, whose mother was in a nursing home and just getting awful treatment. And so he was all for doing something about healthcare in this country, even though he was a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. He even ended up, this was unrelated to Mount Diablo, but I took him up to Sacramento to testify to the legislature one time.
Oh, wow.
And that just deepened his commitment, because the committee that we were testifying to, when he was up there testifying, the Republicans on the committee all got up and walked out.
They walked out?
They walked out.
Oh my gosh.
And kind of stood at the back of the room chatting and stuff, but they were making clear they didn't want to hear anything. And it kind of radicalized this guy. He used to really tease me about being with the union and stuff. He had all kinds of preconceptions about unions. He became one of our leading spokespeople for this. So the community organizing part of it is, going to make all these presentations at these neighborhood associations, churches, other organizations. The organizations are usually the easiest ones to get. It's finding the more mainstream people to sign on with a union, for example, that can present challenges because everybody's got preconceived notions of whatever we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
So we did put together a large group, called it Community Concern for Healthcare or something like that, so that had its own identity. And we started doing presentations, public presentations, turning people out for the hospital district board meetings and speaking their mind and stuff, and really built a powerful coalition that had a lot of people, and it really got everybody's attention, including tenant. And unfortunately, I was not there right at the end, because in the meantime, the Peace and Justice Center had come on hard financial times, and they were asking me to come back and try to save that thing. So I left the union, but not shortly after, my whole campaign resulted in tenant not only taking over the hospital, not only vowing to keep the union in place and keep salaries where they were when they took over, they also signed an agreement to provide, and I don't remember the figure, but $5 or $10 million per year in indigent health care for the community, so that suddenly, this hadn't been an element before. You couldn't get $10 million worth of free health care out of Mount Diablo Hospital, and now Tenant was going to do it. So it was kind of a victory all around, and it had all the classic elements, the grassroots, real community organizing. It was the community coming together, collectivizing their voices, and making demands of those with the final say-so. And we won, surprisingly enough.
And then remind me, the Tenant, is that the name of it?
Yeah, T-E-N-E-T.
Got it. Okay, that's incredible. It's always so good to hear victory stories, because you hear over and over when things don't work, so it's so nice to be like, yes, it does work.
There have been some, but not many. Far more disappointments, I would say, over all these years than victories. But boy, it is nice to savor a victory.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Let me go on to the next question, which is, what is your perspective on how social change occurs?
The quick answer to that is from the bottom up. the which is, and I firmly believe that. I think you can look at history and see that every idea that it has advanced our society or any society has not started with those in power. It started with those without the power and organized together to make demands of those in power. And anything worthwhile will come from the grassroots, from the bottom up, from the community, because those in power aren't really interested in substantially changing power balances. And that's what we're talking about, is changing power balances. And so, you know, one of the things why this tends to work is that those in power do they not only look at their accounting books and look at the bottom line to make sure they're profiting. There's another bottom line that they're concerned about, and that's social, so that things are stable socially. And if you upset that stability and rile things up a little bit, that's part of their balance sheet, and they will respond to an organized, energized, and active public. I think that's what history tells us.
Awesome. All right, and then what tactics and strategies do you think have been the most effective for social change?
Oh, was this on the list of questions? Tactics and strategies.
You know what? I think I might have added this because I wanted to know from your perspective, because it sounds like you've done so many. So, I mean, just like petitioning, rallying, talking to Congress folks, like, are there any that you think are the best at it?
Uh, I would be really hesitant, frankly, to try to name one thing, because all of these campaigns are multifaceted, and one piece, one tactic supports another. So uh, you have to go into any campaign knowing that you need to bring all kinds of elements. The one standard underlying element is to get mass numbers of the grassroots community, not only on your side, but actively vocalizing their desire for some whatever change in policy that you're looking for. And you that can be expressed through petitions. Are really easy, but they're low impact. But especially these days when it's so easy to sign a petition online and circulate a petition online. But so sure, we would do petitions, but really encourage people, like if it's something that's in Congress, to write letters or write phone call and make phone calls. Some personal action, even if it takes the person just 5 minutes, it has more impact on the congressional office than a signature on a petition. Although if you send in a petition with 5,000 signatures, that does have some impact. We once, before the first Gulf War in 1991, I tried something entirely new, and I tried it because actually a salesperson, I didn't even know they had sales reps, from Western Union, the old telegram company, approached me and pitched sending telegrams to our congressman, who at the time was Tom Campbell, a Republican in this district. And we ended up generating 5,000 telegrams to Tom Campbell's Washington office. And he actually at one point took me aside and told me how impressed he was with that. He ended up supporting the war and being a really gung-ho supporter of the war, but that really got his attention. So there's all kinds of tactics, but the basic thing is it comes from numbers of people and people being active in different ways, and then just finding as many ways as people can to express their feelings. And that certainly includes demonstrations and marches and civil disobedience when it comes to that, because that's all part of that social calculus that I was trying to talk about before. When those in power are trying to balance the books, if there's social upheaval, they want that to end, and they need to find a way to uh, balance their books again and calm things back down. So yeah, there's no one thing that will work um, other than throwing everything you've got at it. And if you're working on something that's worth working on, then it's worth throwing everything you can think of at it.
So
And hope.
basically, any way you can keep them from ignoring it is just make it in their face as much as possible.
Yes, yeah. Um, Back in when was NAFTA? That was 92 or something, early 90s, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Anna Eshoo was our fairly new representative in Congress at the time, and she came in with Bill Clinton. We knew she would be, as a freshman congresswoman, very reluctant to oppose Bill Clinton, who wanted the NAFTA agreement. And we determined that one of the best ways to really get her attention was not so much our presenting numbers of um, constituents to her, however we would do that, but in making this more of a public issue than it was. So we came up with some pretty creative demonstrations in front of her office or at Bank of America and things like that that were really good for the TV news cameras and the newspaper photographers. My partner, who was sitting across the room here, Steffi Reeder, who is president of the Peace and Justice Center Board, came up with one of our most successful ones ever was the graveyard of lost jobs.
Oh my goodness.
And we made, what did we have, like 50 tombstone heads that we made out of cardboard and painted and stuff, and all kinds of different jobs. And we would set this up in front of Anna Eshoo's office and then over at Bank of America. And sure enough, every time the media would show up and cover that. And so we could tell Anna was really, because she was being dragged into the newspapers and had to talk to the Mercury News instead of the Peace and Justice Center about how she was feeling, it gave a whole different twinge to it. She ended up voting for it, but she was, I think, so impressed with the level of campaign against her. She actually called me from the cloakroom on the House floor before she went to cast the vote, trying to explain that why she was going to vote for it. She was trying one last time to bring me around, which she knew she wasn't going to do, but she was also trying to, well, she was acknowledging that we had run a really good campaign, and she was keeping communications open for the future so that she didn't just end up, I didn't look on in the newspaper the next morning to find out she had voted in favor. So that was another one of those losses that there's a grain of victory in there that led to a really good long time relationship with Anna Eshoo.
That's really interesting because you would think that especially newer folks who are organizing would get so discouraged, whereas that started a whole partnership. So that's interesting to know that sometimes it's just worth going and going and then trying to see what you get out of that. Right. What is your idea of who is in power in our world and how does that affect the work that you do?
Well, in keeping with my grassroots organizer thing, I would say that the people at the grassroots have the power, but they just don't know it and they don't wield it. That's the wishful thinking part. The real who wields power is money is power around here in our current society, and those who are organized to use that money to for their own ends obviously wield a great deal of political power, policy making, policy shaping power. We see that all the time. We've been seeing it pretty starkly with the pharmaceutical and healthcare companies trying to fight so aggressively against negotiating drug prices, something they do in every other advanced country. But they've got a chance here not to do it here and keep gouging us. So they wield that power. What's the second part of your question? How do you change that?
How does that affect the work that you do? Knowing that money is power, but that people at the grassroots have the power.
It affects it in that that progress can be made through wielding people power. I'll put it that way. And as we've noted several times, it's not always successful, but if it's worth fighting over, then you need to really fight hard and do all you can to change it. Longer term, part of changing the actual power structures, one of the things the Peace and Justice Center does a lot of is educational work. So public forums. Back before the pandemics, we used to do 2 or maybe 3 public educational events a month. That's a lot of education. But as people but you need to engage in that so people do understand the power structures, do understand the nature of their own power, the potential of their own power, and you hopefully inspire them to act on what they're learning. And there's also an aspect that I've heard so many times throughout my career that, well, you're just preaching to the choir. To which I always tell people, you need the choir to come on Sunday and you need them to sing in tune. So, talking to the choir is not so bad. Because you need to pay attention to who's on your side as well and give them the music to play along with or to sing along with.
I love that. That's such a, because I also have felt that before of like, I feel like everyone knows at this point, but of course they don't, there's so many more people that could get educated.
Right.
That's such a great, succinct way of saying it, especially because I've noticed in social justice spaces, a lot of folks want change, but they disagree on how that change should happen. So I think that leads to a lot of hurt feelings and a lot of misunderstanding. So I appreciate that you do those to make sure that people are in sync with what they believe.
Well, as in sync as activists ever get.
Yeah. As long as they're fighting for the same thing, right?
That's right.
All right. And then how do you build and maintain partnerships?
We always try to form coalitions around any kind of major undertaking that we're going to take, whether it was the effort to get the minimum wage raised in city by city locally, or to oppose NAFTA. Forming coalitions is really important. Most groups are willing to act in coalition. The important thing of maintaining a coalition is realizing, I'll just use our own example. The Peace and Justice Center was probably the largest, most powerful grassroots organization, at least in this area, the Peninsula, and lots of groups would join with us, be happy to join with us. But to make us successful, I had to set aside the Peace Center's own power and let it be a fully democratic organization, so that if you're from a group that has 20 members or from the Peace and Justice Center who has 2,000 members, you're all getting the same vote. And so you have to give up a little of your sovereignty, your decision making, on behalf of the collective whole. And if you think they're making a mistake, the majority, you plead your case, but if you lose, and you try to make what has been selected the best you can. And then maybe they'll come around and try your way after all later on. But you really have to commit to, you're not your own organization anymore. You are really committing to being part of this coalition and making the coalition work effectively, and not just looking out for your role in the coalition.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I hadn't thought of that before. That makes total sense. Because I guess it's sort of the same thing of with Congress, you know, and the states and all of that, that you have this many members and then this many, but they all get the same vote. So that makes sense. I'm going to keep that in mind in the future. Thank you. All right. And I appreciate what you said about maintaining too, because I think people are very excited to start things and then forget that it takes work to make sure that everyone still feels included as well.
That's right.
All right.
Very good. Yep.
And then you've already kind of talked about the community organizing skills that you have and some examples, so I can probably pull from that later as well. Are there any that you maybe haven't mentioned that you would like to spotlight or talk about why they're important?
Skills, you mean? Yeah, this is one that I kind of thought through a little bit. You're asking about my own skills. I think the ones that have probably been most important to me, maybe my partner will have something else to say about this, but I think public speaking, being comfortable in public, has been really important. It's a skill that I had apparently some natural ability, but really worked on it by studying other people's speeches and things like that. Because it's such an important way of organizing people. When you go to do these presentations, whether it's a neighborhood association or a church congregation, you need to sway them with your words and with the facts, which brings up what I would say is a next essential skill for an activist, and that is to have good research skills and be committed to doing your homework. You just cannot do this work unless you've really dug deeply into the issue, which means that you end up learning stuff you never thought you wanted to learn and maybe didn't want to learn, but you had to learn. Like around NAFTA, I could just sense that international trade was becoming a big issue. My board at the time thought fighting NAFTA was a little off our agenda. And I said, no, I just think there's going to be something there. But I didn't really know much about international trade and how it works. So it took a lot of research and homework to learn that. So I'd say that's the next one. Multitasking. You have to be able to keep so many balls in the air at one time, because as we were just discussing, any one campaign has a lot of moving parts to it. And if you're kind of a leader in that campaign, you have a responsibility for keeping all those moving parts going. But at the Peace and Justice Center, we were often involved in more than one campaign at a time also. So that's another set of balls to keep in the air over here, and you need to keep them straight and just keep at it. And then the final skill that I would say is pretty essential, and this goes to one of the things we've been talking about throughout this, is patience. Mm-hmm. Knowing that you're in it for the long term. It's worth it to be in it for the long term. Not everybody gets 30 and 50 years at it like I have to have some winning perspective, but uh, you just have to know that you're going to lose a lot, one step forward, maybe three steps back at times. But if you do learn from history, you know that, uh, as the saying goes, the arc of justice is slow to bend, but it does bend, and you can see it in history. And you just need to be patient and persistent.
And then, lastly, I don't want to take up too much of your time. What advice would you give to activists and community organizers, or is there anything else you want to say that you haven't said yet?
Uh, I guess the one thing I would would like to keep emphasizing to activists, and I do this a lot when I do public speaking, is know your history. Know the history of activism and social protest in this country and around the world, but especially in this country, because it's a long, continuous line, really. There's no break between one movement and another. The very first people to oppose the Vietnam War in the early 60s were civil rights organizers in the South who were questioning why they should get drafted to go fight 9,000 miles away when they couldn't get their own human rights here at home.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually, out of the civil rights movement, came the first anti-draft movements, which led into, just folded right into nicely the burgeoning anti-war movement during Vietnam. But you could go back issue through issue. Mother Jones and her children's march on the White House to decry child labor is echoed in the Occupy movement these days. You need to know the history that got us from there to here. It really helps. And it's also encouraging because that's where you do see that the victories come, even though they're few and far between, they are significant.
Funny. All right. Well, that's all that I have, and we're right at the 44-minute mark. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate
Let me
this.
just ask Stephanie, do you think I've missed anything?
No, I think that's really good.
Good. Okay. Thank you.
It was
All
very
right.
thorough to me, so it looks good. All right. Well, thank you. I was really honored to learn about your perspective. I will spread the word. I will tell the people in my community organizing class today, and we kind of talk about what we learned from different organizers. All right. Well, thank you so much.